And thank you, Laura, also from my side for your lecture. I'm really looking forward to talking about it with you and with all our guests. Actually, we are the guests with our colleagues online and on site. So I would like to propose another perspective to address the problem of legitimizing artistic research, and more particularly of legitimizing artistic research by examining the relationships between artistic research and sciences, or better, between artistic research and scientific research. To do so, I will not take a historical approach, but a systematic approach. To begin with, I would like to propose a clear differentiation between research and science. The terms research and science are not synonyms. Research is a broad field that science specifies in a certain way, or better, in certain ways, since within the realm of science, different models are defined. Accordingly, science is not the model, but a model, or better, a group of models. I'm using the term model here, not so much in the sense of an ideal or a perfect case, but rather in the more modest sense of a type or a variety, or even in the sense in which it is used in architecture, that is, as a simplified version of the construction that's at stake, that allows practitioners to better realize, meaning both understand and make, certain aspects of it. In this sense, I propose to examine one model of artistic research. In saying that, I'm assuming that artistic research, structurally speaking, in the same way that scientific research, is a subfield of research within which different models can be outlined. The subjacent idea is that the legitimation of artistic research, or more specifically of each model of artistic research, is not to be found in or to be acquired through its adequacy to another model, for example, a, not the scientific model, but instead in the common ground, or freely paraphrasing the final lines of The Future of Music credo of John Cage, the way they relate to one another, that is, through the principle of organization or humans' common ability to think in an organized way, focusing on one object of research. What I mean is that the legitimation of artistic research can be achieved through the organization of our artistic research processes in ways that show, make evident, or even prove that these are processes of research, not because they are scientific, but because they realize in a specific way the concept of research. In doing so, my horizon, that is, the general goal towards which I move, is the integration of artistic research in global networks of research, or more specifically of transformative research. In other words, my horizon is to incorporate artistic research beyond the field of art into research communities aiming at transforming the worlds we inhabit, which implies our own transformation as inhabitants and agents of transformation of these worlds. Well, this is a big aspiration. Let's be humble and go step by step. So the question now is, what are the structural components of the model of artistic research I work with that enable to identify it as a variety of research? Or, in other words, how does this model realize research? I would like to begin from the end, that is, referring to the kind of goals that this variety of research, of artistic research, pushes. And I would like to begin there due to two reasons. The first and most relevant one is the hypothesis that research is teleological, even a finalistic endeavor. Research is conducted in order to achieve certain goals. The second reason to begin by addressing this issue is that this hypothesis is problematic in the context of art, since artistic practices, this is a second hypothesis, are not, or at least not necessarily, teleological. If both hypotheses are true, it is clear that the composite artistic research is problematic. In order to affirm that the process carried out through artistic practices is a process of research, this problem has to be resolved, or at least has to be inhabited in an operative way. My way to do it intertwines two different dimensions, what I call provisionally the epistemic framework of this model of artistic research and the kind of practices that realize it. Although, as I insinuated before, that the final goal of my research is the transformation of the worlds we inhabit and our ways of inhabiting them, I define as the immediate goal of this model of research to disclose new possible intelligibilities of the investigated issues. In other words, to open new possibilities of understanding it, or even to address it, to approach it. My research, therefore, has a disruptive or destabilizing function. It departs from sedimented or stabilized meanings, for example, of architecture, of embodiment, of contingency, of agency, of atmospheres, and subvert these meanings through the exposition of the inquired issues to the realization of artistic practices. In doing so, the research concepts come to be at disposal for new crystallizations in the domain of meaning. Disclosing new possible intelligibilities through artistic research practices is a variety of conceptual work that does not pursue the production of meaning and therefore also not the production of knowledge, but instead to open up viable trajectories of sense. To criticize the production of knowledge as the goal of a variety of research by offering an alternative implies to criticize the hegemonic framework in which the most part of academic Western research takes place. This framework is outlined within a philosophical discipline, epistemology. In this framework, knowledge is defined as propositional knowledge, that is, as the logical construction of propositions, which are artifacts only possible to be produced in the medium of language, that through processes of validation and justification of initial beliefs, such as perceptions, achieve a correspondence with the reality to which they refer, and therefore can be considered to be true. I think that the definition of other types of knowledge, such as embodied knowledge, tacit knowledge, or knowing how, fail in the attempt to break the hegemony of knowledge as propositional knowledge, reinforcing, on the contrary, a hierarchy in which propositional knowledge remains as the relevant or even as the real one, mirroring classical gradients of forms of knowledge or forms of knowing. And I'm thinking, for example, about Leibniz or Baumgarten. Instead of re-signifying the concept of knowledge, I propose to displace it and to base the model of artistic research to which I am referring on a different conceptual ground. An alternative conceptual ground or an alternative conceptual framework that enables to research through artistic or, as I will propose, aesthetic practices in different media without forcing a reduction of the outcomes to formalization in the media of language through practices of propositional writing, that is, without subordinating aesthetic practices to discursive and logical practices. I found such an alternative framework in the enactive approach to cognition. It would exceed the scope and the time frame of this impulse lecture to deliver a detailed account of this approach. Instead, I would like to point to those fundamental aspects of this approach that allow me to realize my aesthetic research practices. These aspects are basically two. Firstly, a conceptualization of cognition, of thinking, as the continuous process of transformation of surroundings into environments, into worlds, and of bodies into subjectivities, exclusively by virtue of the dynamic and structural coupling between bodies and surroundings. Thinking in this framework is not reduced to certain linguistic or semiotic processes, but extended to the transformative dynamics of life. Secondly, thinking is not understood as an activity whose objective is the fixation of meaning of an ostensibly pre-existing reality, but instead the engagement, the participation in viable and collective processes of sense-making. In this framework, aesthetic practices, understood as practices that mobilize our sensory, motor, and emotional skills within non-hierarchical fields of distributed human and non-human living and non-living agencies, can be realized without restraining constraints. Aesthetic practices can engage spontaneously, that is, by virtue of their own connective dynamics, in collective processes of sense-making. Aesthetic practices can be practiced as forces that enable simultaneously to contribute to environmental and subjective transformations, to become aware of the new possible environments and subjectivities that emerge out of these processes, and to produce artifacts that allow all the members of the research community for establishing contact, for achieving access to these processes of co-emergence. Summarizing, the model of artistic research, or probably better, of aesthetic research that I practice and outline through my practicing, can be legitimized as research because it encompasses at least three constitutive components of what can be considered to be research. It pursues, again in standard terms, clearly defined epistemic goals. It does it in a determined conceptual framework, and it proposes to achieve these goals through specific practices. That is, again in standard terms, it has a clear methodological approach. In the short time of this impulse lecture, I try to clarify the main traits of a model of artistic research in order to demonstrate that it accomplishes fundamental constitutive features of research. That is, that it realizes research in a specific way. And I did so in this context, firstly, in order to offer another non-hierarchical relationship between artistic and scientific research. And secondly, in order to provide an alternative strategy of legitimation of artistic research, realized in its own terms, which consist in demonstrating that particular models of artistic research specify research through artistic practices within the adequate conceptual framework in the very same way that scientific research specifies and realizes research through scientific practices. Thank you.